Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through and ranking my 10 favourite solo performance albums. I'm not talking about solo albums here, I'm talking about albums that has one person on it performing all the way through. I'm not talking about one person on that album that's overdubbing all the parts like Mike Oldfield on Tubular Bells. I'm not about that, or using tons of loops. I'm talking about someone who has an instrument and on their own they create an album worth of material. Now, I'm not going to be including the vast amount of albums like that from the classical world where people will interpret Bach on piano, or they'll do Mozart or whatever it is. You can see I've got an album behind me of someone playing a solo harp classical recital, so I won't be including that. There's also a ton of singer-songwritery albums and blues albums, and I will be giving a nod to that with a couple of choices on here, but on the whole this is going to be coming from the jazz world. This is something that emerged in the jazz world quite early on, where you would have someone just performing, usually on piano on their own, for a whole album, okay, of jazz standards. In the 60s and then the 70s this became a really important type of release, and the success of the Koln concert by Keith Jarrett, which is one of the biggest selling jazz albums in history, really created a definite sort of genre of these albums. So there will be a lot of albums coming out of that sort of post ECM solo performance world on here. Some of my favourite albums of all time are in that category. So let's get on with this and let's start at number 10, and at number 10 I have Solo Concerts by Ralph Towner. Ralph Towner is a guitarist who plays nylon string classical guitar, 12-string guitar and piano. He works within the jazz idiom, but he isn't a jazz guitarist like, say, Joe Pass or Wes Montgomery, and he's not a fusion guitarist like John McLaughlin or Al Di Meola. He has a certain approach that comes from classical technique. He first came to prominence in the acoustic Americana jazz group. That's the best way I can describe them, Oregon. Oregon came out in the early 70s, and they were playing definitely jazz, and an improvised swinging form of music, but that explored what I would call the American aesthetic, which is this idea of the American landscape embodied within music. That's the best way to describe it. Oregon grew out the Paul Winter Consort, you know, and they had a really interesting instrumentation, often using sort of percussion, tabla, sitar, saxophone, classical guitar, piano, that type of sound. It's a very beautiful sound, and I haven't talked enough about Oregon on this channel. Ralph Towner came out of that band. He played on the second Weather Report album. He is on Icing the Body Electric. He does an incredible sort of solo 12-string performance on that album, and for the fusion guys who watch this channel and know that track, if you like that, you will love this album, Solo Concerts. It's an absolutely incredible album, really coming out of the tradition of ECM solo performed albums, and actually on ECM records as well. Obviously with the success of the Koln concert, ECM really pushed this way of making albums, because of course it's very cheap as well. And I think this is one of the best ones. Ralph Towner has such a signature sound, such an incredible approach to improvisation, and when these albums are at their best, it's like you're turning a tape recorder on in someone's mind, and that's what you hear when you listen to this album. It's not just some virtuoso acoustic guitarist who's just jumping through hoops, you know, they've got all these tricks. It's not like that. You feel the exploratory nature as Ralph Towner, as he uses his instrument to make these instant compositions and weave his way through certain prepared material, but with the real fluidity and freedom, which is really exciting. The guitar sounds absolutely beautiful. His use of harmonics within the playing is absolutely incredible. This isn't a technical thing. You don't go to this album to be impressed by the virtuosity. It's not like Michael Hedges or John Gomez. It's not that type of thing, and it predates that as well. Ralph Towner is a very important musician. I haven't talked about him enough on this channel, so I'm really great and really happy to I am really great, but I'm really happy to be able to you know, have a Ralph Towner album on the channel and suggest it to you all so you can go and check it out. So that's what I got. Number 10 is Solo Concerts by Ralph Towner. At number 9, I have an album that for me comes out of that tradition, right? And it is One Quiet Night by Pat Metheny. Right, so Pat Metheny originally also signed to ECM Records, coming out of that sort of American aesthetic that I've just described, which I think was really pioneered by not only Oregon but also Gary Burton, that he was a member of. So he's playing a type of jazz that it's not the blues or jazz aesthetic. It's a different type of aesthetic which takes in sort of American folk forms, country and western music, but also for me points to the American landscape. This is a really interesting thing that I haven't mentioned on this channel before. He came out with an album on ECM Records in the late 70s, which was a solo acoustic guitar album. It was used overdubbing, and I think there's a couple of guests on there as well. And that album is called I can't say it. New Twak. This is the only problem with me. I can never pronounce stuff. Oh, I don't know if it's because I'm English that I can't pronounce these foreign words. It's you know the album I mean, don't you? New Chattanooga Choo Choo. There we go. I'm going to call it that. New Chattanooga Choo Choo. It's a much better title for that album. And I'm not even talking about that album anyway. I'm talking about One Quiet Night. Now this album differs from. I can't even get my words out today. This album differs from New Chattanooga Choo Choo in that it's very impromptu. I think I read when it came out that Pat Metheny had been sent a new acoustic guitar to try out from his guitar company. It's lovely when you're famous and they'll send you some free stuff over. And he got sent this guitar and he thought, well, try this out. So he sticks it into his sort of little home recording system that he's got probably in his living room somewhere. And he puts a little bit of reverb on it and he starts playing and he tries different ideas. On the spur of the moment, he just tries his tunes. I might try Beatles tunes, that jazz stand, I might do a blues. Let's just have an improvisation. And he sits there and does this. And I think he gets up the next morning. I'm probably embellishing this loads, but this is how I imagined it. He gets up the next morning and he puts it on and he goes, wow, this is really good. I'm going to put this out as an album. And I love that. Unintended albums, incredible. And you listen to it and again, it's just like going right down deep into Pat Metheny's mind, his musical mind. And you're able to just go to the source and drink from the source of his genius. So that's the album I've got at number 8 is One Quiet Night by Pat Metheny. At number, that was number 9, wasn't it? Oh my God. I had a gig last night, right? I had a gig last night and it was so hot and I got very thirsty. The only bottle I could get was one of those big bottles with the drinks that's got a ton of caffeine in. It was like a massive bottle. Right, so I'm doing this gig and I'm playing. We played almost like 2 hours straight, and I'm getting on, but I'm still really hitting them, playing fast and hard, a lot of heavy stuff. And I'm drinking this bottle because I'm hot, you know. And I get off stage, and I was like this when I came off stage. And I woke up this morning, and I thought, oh, I'm going to do a YouTube video, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing me in this sort of post. Caffeine and sugar induced psychosis, really. So I'm going to try my best. I'm going to keep going because we have to keep going in life. You know, you can't just. I tried to do this video a couple of days ago and it just completely failed. That's very rare for me. And I thought, I've got to do it. I'm going to do it today. I don't know why this one's so hard for me. I think it's jumping around. There's a lot of interesting albums to talk about. And at number 8, I have a very interesting album, and it is Spontaneous Inventions by Bobby McFerrin. Bobby McFerrin, of course, is one of the greatest musicians of recent times. He's an absolute giant. He's one of my favourite musicians. He occupies his own space in music. Bobby McFerrin is a singer, and he's taken that sort of scat jazz tradition. He's taken sort of opera. He's taken sort of modal harmonic jazz post-beat, but the whole thing, and he's created this solo vocal style which utilizes his ability to jump notes very quickly. So he jumps some pitch ranges very quickly, which gives the illusion that he's singing a bass part and a counterpoint part and the vocal at the same time. So he uses beatboxing, and he'll make sounds on his chest, alter the sound in his voice. And he's also able to mimic sounds. At one minute he can sound like a soul singer, one minute he can sound like an electric guitar, one minute he can sound like an opera singer, you know, or he can sound like sub bass, you know, on a drum and bass track. And he weaves all these in using a whole vast array of improvisatory techniques. You know, he has done a number of concerts where he just walks out with a microphone and the audience, and he'll work with the audience. He'll get them to sing stuff, and he'll get them to be involved in the thing that's going on. He's absolutely unique. Now, the album that really sort of heralded this approach was his second album that was called The Voice, and that truly is a solo performed album. This one here, Spontaneous Inventions, has got a couple of extra players, and I think Herbie Hancock's on it and a couple of others, but we're going to ignore that. I'm going to bend the rules a little bit, because this album is absolutely incredible. And this is where he won the Grammy for doing this thing. And what's so interesting is Bobby McFerrin is so out there, he's so individualistic, he's such a virtuoso, and yet he had one of the biggest singles of the 80s, didn't he, with Don't Worry, Be Happy, which often comes on the list of the worst songs of all time, which I think is ridiculously unfair, because that song is absolutely incredible. Yes, it's very chirpy and happy, but I always feel like there's a little bit of sarcasm and wry humour to what Bobby McFerrin's there. He's a monster musician that knows what he's doing, and I think he's deliberately writing something very commercial. That song will come on the radio and everyone will sing along to it, and they will not register the fact that the only instruments on there is Bobby McFerrin's voice. But of course that is all overdubbed, and that album sold millions. But if you want to go back and hear him doing his thing, it's Spontaneous Inventions. So that's what I've got at number 8, Spontaneous Inventions. Right. At number 7, I have by the jazz guitarist Joe Pass, Virtuoso, that came out on Pablo Records in the early 70s, I think 1973. This is an incredible album. Those of you who watch Rick Beato's channel, I seem to be chatting about Rick a lot. Rick's mentioned this album over and over again and how important it was to him. This is a shocking album. Joe Pass, right, brings an album out called Virtuoso, and you don't think, how arrogant is that? You know, to call your own album Virtuoso. Because you imagine, it's not Joe that's called it the album that, it's somebody else, right? Joe's just come in, picked up his guitar, done a solo jazz album like that. His solo jazz approach apparently came out of just going to parties and someone handing him a guitar and saying, "Do you want to play something?" And so, well, I don't know, I'll play Stellar by Starlight. And then on the spur of the moment, right then, he would create an arrangement. This is a serious guitar player, you know. Guitarists like Joe Pass, when I watch them play, because I play guitar, but when I watch Joe Pass play, I go, now, I own a guitar. Most of us only own guitars. When you watch Joe Pass, you realise that that's how you play a guitar. Joe Pass emerged on the scene quite late because he was sort of discovered in a drugs rehabilitation program where they went into this organisation. I really wish I could name the album, and I should know this, it's terrible. And they went in and recorded this album of these musicians, this drug rehabilitation program, and Joe was one of the musicians, and everyone discovered a virtuoso. If you go back and listen to him playing on that, he is unbelievable, right? So in the early 70s, signed to Pablo Records, they pull him in, he makes a solo the jazz guitar album. I think he didn't even plug the guitar in. I think he was playing like a Gibson hollow body, and I think they just mic'd it up acoustically. There's a very particular sound to this. It's very acoustic, very organic, very woody, and it's almost like he's right there in front of you. You're just watching this guy, and he performs miracles on the guitar on this. If you're a guitarist and you haven't heard Virtuoso, go and check it out. Joe Pass, one of the greats. I spoke about him on my last video where I've talked about my favourite jazz albums of the 70s, and I'm really chuffed to be able to talk about him here and mention this album Virtuoso. It really is important, and I cannot believe it's so low on the list. It should have maybe been a bit higher up. But we got some absolutely monumental albums to come, so stay tuned. I'll put a gap in here so there's an advert. See, YouTube says that they'll put adverts in the gap, so I'll put an advert. So that was like a proper ad break. I know I got me adverts on there, everyone moans about it, but I've got to make a bit of money, I can't just do this for nothing. I'm not a charity. Anyway, 10, 9, 8, 7. So at number 6, I've got a pretty difficult album here. This is a difficult listen. I've put at number 6 For Alto by Anthony Braxton. Anthony Braxton is a free jazz saxophone player. Really incredibly difficult listen, Anthony Braxton, right? Really difficult. He comes out of the jazz tradition, but he's almost moving free jazz to almost like a modern classical approach, a very intellectual, cerebral approach. In the late 60s, he brought an album of solo saxophone out, and I actually think for him it's pretty accessible. If you approach it like, here's a guy with alto saxophone, and he's going to attempt to make an album of solo alto improvised music, alto saxophone improvised music, and he is going to use every aspect of music that is available to him. Not just melody, harmony and pitch, but also timbre, volume, dynamics, noise, sound, space, time, the whole thing. And that's what you hear. Now, this album could well be one of the first albums of a solo instrument that's just not like piano or guitar. So in that respect, it's a very, very groundbreaking album. I knew when I came up with this, I thought I've got to put For Alto on this list because it's so important when we're talking about this. Came out in the late 60s. Actually, a couple of years later, in 1971, John McLaughlin made My Goals Beyond, and side one of that is also a solo guitar album, although it's overdubbed. There's 2 tracks of guitar and a little bit of overdubbed percussion. And I think with those 2 albums, you seem to start to get the momentum in the 70s of this sort of solo performed style, right? In the early 70s, ECM became very interested in this approach, and the album I've got at number 10, I'm going to have to put numbers on this list next time, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. So at number 5, I've cheated again. I've always cheated with my criteria. I've put 2 albums on here, but you can just pick either one because they're just as brilliant as each other. And I put Chick Corea's Piano Improvisations Part 1 and Part 2. That's 2 separate albums. My God, these albums are incredible albums. Really are. They predate Keith Jarrett's solo piano albums. They're completely improvised. And when I heard them as a young man, and I first bought this, it was this that I was blown away by. Not by Keith Jarrett or anybody else. This was the album that I put on, and it really did feel to me, and this is where I got the idea from, that it's like turning a tape recorder on in Chick Corea's head. And that's the thing I love about these sort of albums. And Chick Corea is at a point in his career where he is dealing with very similar ideas to Anthony Braxton. This is very cerebral, very dense, modern classical influences. He's just moving towards Scientology, and of course the Scientology thing changes his direction, and he starts to want to become much more accessible, and he forms Return to Forever, the acoustic Latin version, and then you get the fusion thing, and he's done that, but he's also dipped back to this much more esoteric cerebral approach that is on Piano Improvisations. On Piano Improvisations Part 2, he tries to emulate leaving planet Earth on a piano, and for me he achieves it, and he pulls every single sound out of a piano that you possibly can. It's like Jimi Hendrix is playing a piano. These albums are incredible. Right, they really are, and I think they're monumental. And I think tracking it from For Alto by Anthony Braxton, My Goals Beyond, and then this album coming out on ECM, that opens up this idea of the solo performed album, which reaches its peak with the album that I have at number 4. And it is, of course, the Koln Concert by Keith Jarrett. Now, if I was being more subjective here, I wouldn't even choose this album as being my favourite solo piano album by Keith Jarrett. That could well be Concerts or The Moth and the Flame, which is The Moth and the Flame is the first one I heard, and I absolutely loved that album. And then Moth and the Flame came out with, it's a double album with an album called Invocations, which is an album of his solo performed church organ. You know, he was in the cathedral improvising on church organ. He has made solo performed albums on like harpsichord. He has done solo performed albums on a whole manner of instruments where, you know, using overdubbing. Keith Jarrett is the undoubted king master of the solo performed album, right? In the mid-70s, I think he had he made an album called Facing You, probably in the wake of Piano Improvisations by Chick Corea. He makes an album called Facing You on ECM Records. It's relatively successful. I think the idea of being able to book a concert somewhere, put a relatively simple recording set up and make an album in an hour and a half at a concert is very attractive to ECM. And so they decide to record another concert at Koln. Keith Jarrett turns up, he gets there, the piano's not satisfactory at all, it's not in tune, it's not right, it's not a full-size piano, it's a certain type of piano, it's a little bit smaller. He sits down and plays it, they try and get another piano and they can't, and they can't cancel the concert because there's an audience bought ticket, so he decides to play this piano. He's turned up, he hasn't eaten, and everything is against the recording of this album. So he sits down, and I think because he is restricted in a way, especially in terms of the regions on which he can play on the piano, right? He starts to draw things in, I think. He tries to find a focus and direction, really pulling on influences from gospel music that he'd really been experimenting with in his American quartet. And what he does is he creates something which is actually very, very accessible. It's very easy to follow. He creates a line through the music which is very attractive to people. This album comes out, and then shockingly for ECM Records, goes on to sell millions of copies. I think when it first came out, it sold 1 million copies. And I think it's probably around about the 6 to 8 million range. This is incredible. It's the biggest selling solo anything album in history. It secures Keith Jarrett financially, that he never has to worry about anything again. And it also, along with Pat Metheny's album, secures ECM as well. They're now financially stable enough to really be able to invest in high quality recording of really esoteric subject matter. For example, solo concerts I've just mentioned earlier on this list. So Koln Concert is a groundbreaking album, and it's why I wanted to do this list, because this list's important. I've often said to my students, if they've got a creative block and they're an instrumentalist, try and make an album of solo material. You know, just try and plug your instrument in. Don't think in terms of trying to be clever or virtuoso. Just trying to make something that's got an atmosphere, and try and create atmospheres on your instrument. And I think that way of approaching it is so anti the album and the history of the album of having, you know, what we have now when they're made on computers and they're multi-layered and everything's sampled in. The idea of somebody just sitting down with an instrument and creating 40 minutes worth of music is a very incredible thing. The last 3 albums are like some of the most important albums in the history of music. So you might have not thought this list was very important, but it is. I'm going to cover 3 albums that are like, if you had these 3 albums, you might have the whole history of 20th century music nailed. So at number 3, I have Piano Starts Here by Art Tatum, which was made in the early 30s by the great piano virtuoso Art Tatum, and it's him sitting playing the piano all on his own. This is the definition of virtuosity. Any musician that comes after this album, whether it's Oscar Peterson, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Yngwie Malmsteen, Steve Vai, whatever, when you are dealing with virtuosity, you are pointing to this album. But not only that, Art Tatum raises the level of jazz. He raises it to a point where classical musicians were hearing this album going, what is this? We can't get our head around. Is this 2 pianists playing? How could someone that's not coming out of the classical tradition play like this? Structurally, harmonically, it lays the groundworks for bebop and modal jazz and a whole host of things. This is an incredible album. Art Tatum was born in right at the beginning of the 20th century. He's a little bit later than Louis Armstrong. He's partially blind. I'm going to say something that might be a little bit contentious here. But talking to people I know that really know about jazz piano, I think he had a very singular approach to music that may well have had its roots in some sort of autism or Asperger's. Many musicians are on that spectrum. I believe I'm on that spectrum slightly. I think there's most musicians will nod their head when they hear that. I think this is a really important thing to make. I think Tatum had a very singular approach, very focused approach. He was very competitive, you know. If he heard any pianist was around that was had any ability whatsoever, he would literally go into that club and destroy them. Pianists would get terrified when he turned up. You know, they used to say, God is in the house. There is an interview between Count Basie and Oscar Peterson where Count Basie, and he winds Oscar Peterson up because he's trying to get Oscar to play like Art Tatum, and Oscar doesn't want to do it because he's got too much respect for the master. And Oscar Peterson, who was like the sort of heir of Art Tatum, tells this story about God in the house, you know, and this idea, you know, you'd be playing piano and suddenly someone would turn up and say, Art Tatum's turned up, and you go, all right, okay, you know, because if he found you, he was going to come and destroy you. And, you know, he would walk in and say, like, do you want me to beat you? Shall I just beat you with my left hand? So this is a really competitive, virtuoso musician, partially blind, you know, perhaps on the spectrum, but I got no evidence of that. But I know a lot of pianists I've spoken to have questioned whether that was the case. That it really took jazz to a level that really established it as one of the great art forms, musical art forms of all time. I have spoken about this elsewhere on my greatest jazz albums of all time. So if you're interested in solo music, you're interested in virtuosity, go and check out Piano Starts Here by Art Tatum. And it has come out under a bunch of other names. It's basically the recordings of the early 30s stuff with like T for Two and all that stuff. Right. Yeah, right, we've got two albums at number 2 and number 1. These could well be both number 1, and they're not jazz albums. And I wasn't going to put them on the list. I thought I can't do this without having these two albums. These, again, two of the most important albums in the history of 20th century music. So at number 2, I've got the complete works of Robert Johnson. It is what I said it is. This is a guy walking into some hotel somewhere. They've set up some, you know, basic recording apparatus in the corner of some hotel room. This guy wanders off the streets. He's not well known. He's got a local following. It's a small record label taking a risk on someone. Do you want to come down, try some recordings out? Yeah. And he sits down, right, and he plays, all right? And then he gets paid and he walks out. They invite him back a couple of weeks later. He records a few more and then he's gone. And he not only leaves that hotel, Robert Johnson walks out of history. He walks out of history and somehow dies at some point, okay? But that reputation's there. Alan Lomax, the great white saviour of Americana, John Alan Lomax, who I spoke about on my Lead Belly video, he goes down to find Robert Johnson and you can't find him, you know. So that reputation's there. I think he grabs Big Bill Brunsey, who readily steps into that role. You know, I have a very strong theory that you know, Afro-Americans at that time were quite clever and they knew what the corporate music world wanted and they gave them it. You know, I think a lot of those musicians were a much more wider and much more musical versatile than this want of that sort of elite middle class corporate music world wanted. They wanted to hear this authentic Delta blues, right? When I put on this album and listen to it, what shocks me is the fact that we don't know much about this guy. You know, we got 2 or 3 photographs of him. You know, people have been trying to piece that life together, but you can't touch it. And yet when you put the headphones on and hear it, You're in the room with this guy. And what he's doing is astonishing. You know, when I first heard as a kid, I found it really difficult, this Robert Johnson, because I just thought, this is just really archaic blues. It's not archaic. It's unbelievably sophisticated. Listen to the guitar parts. It sounds like almost two guitar players playing at once. With all these contrary things going on. And he twists the form of the blues. And he extends it and stresses it. And that voice soaring above it all. Pulling in the great tradition of songwriting that goes back through America, through history, back to, to Africa. It goes back to Europe. It goes back to Scotland, to Ireland. A whole host of things Robert Johnson's pulling in, but presenting it in a way which is absolutely unique and absolutely new. And really, in terms of virtuosity, putting in stone one of the greatest documents of that songwriting tradition that came out of America at that time, okay? But it sits there dormant, doesn't it? There's a little seed there. Alan Lomax, there's a little seed. People discuss him. And so there has always been a love affair between the middle-class educated elites and American folk and blues, right? They go searching it out. They go searching it out with a lens. It's like quantum physics. They change it by looking at it. And it's that searching that eventually ends up in, especially the UK in the 60s, with a bunch of very middle-class, educated musicians, exploring the history of American folk forms and the blues and discovering Robert Johnson and then starting to record it and basically creating rock music and jazz fusion and prog. All comes out of that search, right? But it didn't just happen in the UK. It had happened earlier than that. There's one guy that had gone there before anybody in, I think, the UK did, and that's, of course, Bob Dylan. And that's the guy I have at number one. At number one, I have Freewheeling by Bob Dylan. And, of course, I've cheated because there's a track on there called Carina Carina, which has got a band on it. So let's just ignore that. On the whole, this is Bob Dylan in a room with his acoustic guitar singing into a mic and putting this album down. And this is perhaps the most important album in the history of rock and pop. That's what I think, okay? It's his second album. His first album is very similar. He's in a room with acoustic guitar, and I was going to put that on because on there he's doing his interpretation of Buddy Guthrie tunes, Lead Belly, Blind Willie's tunes. He's doing his interpretation of those tunes, right? He is one of those guys that went and searched the truth out. This is a white, middle-class, educated American searching the truth out there. What's there? What can we learn from these people? We need to open the doors up to these people. There's a wisdom, there is a beauty there. And we need to access that. It's not the beauty of European culture, it's something else. The opening in the 1960s, culturally, to those voices, and not just those voices, but voices of other minorities, is basically what created rock music. And rock music is like the middle finger to the establishment. And you think, well, why do that? Why is that important? And the reason it's important, it's not just to stick the middle finger up. It's to then go, well, look, we don't just want to listen to you. There's another way of thinking. There's another way of doing. Bob Dylan in 1962 is there. Now, I can't stand Bob Dylan, right? I would really struggle getting through these albums. I like his first album a little bit more because I like those tunes. But is his interpretations as good as Lead Belly? Of course not. Of course not. But what he does is, by presenting those albums, and there's a wave of youth coming up in the 1960s, especially in the UK, and I've met them. Remember, I played for Robert Plant, and I remember talking to these guys, and these guys walked around with that Bob Dylan album under their arm. It was a badge that said they were in a certain club, right? These are kids that had been blown away by Elvis Presley, then discovered Little Richard, then discovered Chuck Berry, and they were enthralled by rock and roll. In the UK, they then were into skiffle as well, and loved skiffle, and skiffle's opening the door to this English aesthetic route into people like Lead Belly and all that stuff. They're taking that in, right? They're listening to Robert Johnson, they're exploring that. And then Bob Dylan in 1962, the key year in the history of rock and pop, where everything shifts, not 55, 62. The cultural world shifts on its axis in 1962. And Dylan's album's right in the middle of it, and everybody hears it. And that album, it's really hard to explain what it does for music, because it changes almost everything. I can remember, because I don't get it. I know I don't get Dylan. You know, I get it. I can intellectually get it. If I put the album on, I don't enjoy it. So that's the thing. And I know people love it. I listen to the lyrics. His lyrics are mystical and weird, and I never know what he's on about. And I can remember when I played with Robert Plant, turning around to him and said, "Why was Dylan so important?" And he turned around and said, "Before then, we were just, listening and singing songs about driving around in cars and getting girls." And Dylan changed all of that, right? But also Dylan was not an Afro-American musician steeped in that culture. He opened the doors for people outside that culture to embrace it. All right? Now, on this channel, I have been critical of identity politics, and this is a central theme to this channel. I think what those guys were doing then is completely different. They were dealing with identity, but they were trying to shut that down and open it all up. They wanted to treat everyone as individuals. They want to say, look, I love this music, and surely I can play this music. Yes, Bob Dylan, you can sing a Lead Belly song, and you can play it on electric guitars, and you can invent a whole style of music, and all that music that creates rock and pop, and all of that. If we go to now, and people would do that now, they would say that's cultural appropriation, surely. So if you agree with cultural appropriation, you have to cancel the whole of rock, pop, soul, all of it. All of it. All right? It's not a wise thing to do. Dylan, the fact that this Jewish, white, American, middle-class man covered these songs, right, in his way, and then on this album, I've talked about this for a long time. I knew I would. I knew this video would end up being about Bob Dylan, because I knew I had to deal with it. And then on Freewheelin, he takes the essence of that, the essence of those songs, but he starts to talk to it. He starts to sing from his point of view, as a young man at the beginnings of this cultural shift. Right? And it doesn't matter what he was saying. It doesn't matter how he sung. It doesn't matter how he played. He is going to, with this album, democratize music on every single level. Right? If you look at Zappa's first album, Frank Zappa's first album, on the liner notes, he mentions the influences, and Bob Dylan's on there. When Zappa heard Dylan, he went, "Oh my God, I can now bring in modern classical influences if I want. I can bring in rhythm and blues. I can bring them all. I can do whatever I want, can't I? Dylan can do that. I'm not going to do what Dylan did, because I've said how important Dylan is to Frank Zappa. I've said how important Dylan is to progressive rock, to jazz fusion. And people go, well, it doesn't sound like Bob Dylan, so how could it be? No, it's not that. He allowed everybody to rip the rule book up, and do whatever they thought, to express themselves in any way they saw fit. Right? And the things that they embodied in our culture have now atrophied. And even though that idea of self-expression and you could be anything you want, which embodies every single Disney and Hollywood, storyline now, has atrophied. And everyone would be scared to death if people are actually to express themselves in the way they wanted. Okay? And this is why it's so important to realise what these guys did. I think it's so important. We're losing it. We're losing it in that we're celebrating it so deeply. You know, this stuff has become rarefied. It's now legendary. You know, I've got a YouTube channel. Just by talking about these guys, people will click on just to hear stories, to hear information about these people. And I know how important they are. I know that there is something of huge worth. Culturally, in terms of art, when you get to the second half of the 20th century, the centre, the most important thing is in rock, soul, jazz, funk. It's in what we used to call popular music. You know, before then, popular music just what it was, just it was music. It was popular. It didn't really matter. You could pick it up and drop it down. It had no depth, right? But there was a blip in the second half of the 20th century where pop music was the most important art form on the planet, right? And the guy that we could say more than any other person that was responsible, that was for Bob Dylan. In 1965, he started to use electric instruments, guitar, drums, started to add that into the mix. And he recorded in 65 a tune called Like a Rolling Stone. That tune, to me now, when I put it on 1965, listen to that track, it just sounds like it's in the future. It's incredible. So as much as I don't really get him, because I'm a muso and I like my pretty chords and I like my virtuoso playing and I like to hear people playing with soul. And God, when someone else plays a Dylan tune, it becomes one of the great tunes of all time, whether it's the Byrds or Hendrix, you know. Dylan, genius, really is. He really is. The three most important musicians of the 20th century are Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bob Dylan. With Dylan and Duke Ellington sort of on the same level. That's what I think. Doesn't mean it's right, it's just my opinion. I've got to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this one. I don't think this title is clickbaity enough to pull them in. I'm going to have to think of a more clickbaity title. And it needs to say what it is. And then I need to have a subtitle, and the subtitle goes on the thumbnail, and it needs to be something like the man who invented everything. The man that invented, what did he can't even say he invented rock music or prog, or his importance is too big. I don't know. He definitely invented something. If you're watching now, you are just sat here watching me think. Really? I might do that. I'm going to do a video where I just think about stuff and you can just watch me think. There was a philosopher called Wittgenstein, one of the greatest philosophers in history, and he used to teach, I think, Oxford or Cambridge, one of the two. I think it was Oxford. I got a 50-50 chance. Anyway, that's not important. He used to put deck chairs out in his classroom, and he'd hardly get anybody coming in because his lectures were so difficult, but the students would turn up and Wittgenstein would sit down, and they'd sit down, he'd walk in, and he'd sit down in his deck chair, and then they would watch the pain while he thought. They would sit and watch him think. Waiting for the utterance of wisdom. And that is how I see myself here on this channel. I see myself as a musical Wittgenstein, and you, my followers, come here and you sit waiting for the utterances of wisdom and beauty. While he's welling up from below as I speak. And it is. Whatever comes into my mind will be me channeling the Great Spirit from the Spirit through me to you. and I'm about to utter whatever comes into my head right now. My phone beeped. Maybe someone's messaged me. Or is that beep because it's running out of power? I don't know, I can't remember the beeps. Why don't you even know the beeps, Andy? You got to know your beeps. Oh my God, I mean, that could be somebody important messaging me. Do I answer it in the middle of the video? I'm supposed to be a wise man here and showing them how clever and intellectual and making them feel slightly inferior. And here I am now, my phone's beeped and I'm getting all anxious because, you know, it could be somebody important. It could be bad news. It could be bad news. Oh, I can't deal with bad news. I don't like bad news. That's the worst thing. I sit in bed worrying about bad news. And you know something, right? How much time do we spend worrying about things that never actually happen?